we are also children of the same God. We ask that you guide our dear friend Kirsten, who will be presenting tonight, and may she be a vessel of light presenting this topic that is so important to us. Bless those who are on the way, those who will be watching at home, and in the future as well, as this will be recorded for our brothers and sisters to learn, to share in the future. We thank you for this beautiful opportunity, and so be it. Before we finish this book, right, Kirsten? I would like just to point out something as I was actually preparing ourselves here to begin. This is chapter 16 of the book, Times of Health and Conscientiousness. And this is part 2 of this book entitled Conscientiousness and Responsibility, the chapter of the title of the chapter. And I was talking to Kirsten that it has been quite some time that she has been working on this. And I would like to thank you for the hard work, bringing these lessons from Joanna DeAngelis, sharing this with us. And it's a beautiful work because it hopefully thus far has given you brought some enlightenment as well and enhanced your life as well. And please read the book, read the chapters, right? Because it's important for us to bring to our hearts our own takeaways as well. But with no further ado, Kirsten, please. What is Joanna DeAngelis saying about conscientiousness and responsibility?
It might be up here. Thank you, Leo. Good evening. Hello, everyone. Well, what a sense of responsibility. I even feel kind of nervous today. Yes, thank you, Leo, for that reminder. It has been quite a while. I think it's been about almost 2 years we've been working through this book. And this week I actually remembered to bring it with me. I mean, it's a fantastic book. You can get it on Amazon. And what can we say? It's a great book. And it truly is, it's a book to be studied. It's not a book just to pick up. I mean, you can just pick it up and read a chapter if you want and set it aside and have it be that and pick it up periodically. And sometimes we do that. But this book is such a wealth of knowledge. I mean, it just looks like a regular book. But to me, having gone through college and graduate school, you know, we look at this and I'm like, wow, this really should look more like a textbook, because that's what it feels like when you're reading it. I mean, the way in which Joanna writes and how she explains things is so profound. It pushes the barriers of our own understanding. But I digress. Conscientiousness and responsibility. You know, recently I had to give how shall I call it, a presentation for work, and my big boss was meeting with me, and one of the things he said to me, he gave me a bit of advice when giving presentations, and he said something, and I'm going to use it here in this moment. He said, whenever you're giving a presentation, at least, you know, working for the government, you know, you have to always be ready that whoever you're presenting to may have originally said to you, you have 20-30 minutes, you know, and you prepare for 20-30 minutes to give a 20-30 minute talk. But in the last moment, as you get to the meeting, they might say, oh, Kirsten or whoever is presenting, things change. You have 5 minutes, so you need to present. So he said to me, always have in your head the top 3 things you want to get out to your public. So I thought about this today, and maybe it'll be 3 things, maybe it'll be 2, or maybe it'll be 1. But one thing for sure we hope that folks take away from this is the understanding of conscientiousness and responsibility, and how wonderful it is to embrace our responsibilities, our duties, and that it brings light to our lives. It colors our lives. It gives our lives meaning. Without a sense of responsibility, without responsibilities, there's no real meaning. We lack meaning. And this is pretty well illustrated in, before I go to this, pretty well illustrated in a well-known, at least I believe it should be well-known. I think this is the right remote for this? Freeze, yeah. In the well-known children's story, and I think this is pretty universal. I think everyone knows the story of Pinocchio, right? Okay. So everyone knows the story of Pinocchio. The story of Pinocchio is the archetypal story of the forever child and several other different types of archetypes, but the forever child. And for the story of Pinocchio is the story of the human condition. It's quite more profound if you think about it. I mean, I watched this as a kid. I've watched this with my kids. But if we analyze this, and I watched this psychologist, who's a psychotherapist as well, he gave a really good analysis of this story, and I thought it was fantastic. And in analyzing the story of Pinocchio, it is much like our own story, right? We are going out into the world, as it were, as he was. And then along the way, he gets misled by this character. He has a funny name, and I'm forgetting it. John, or I'm completely forgetting. I'm blanking. He has a really funny name, like, does anyone remember his name? I'm completely blanking on it. But it's a word like, I'll remember it later. These things happen to me now as I'm getting older. So he gets misled by Mr. Fox, let's call him that. And he gets tricked into believing that going to school is boring, having responsibilities is boring, and he should go with him along to Pleasure Island. And so he does. And I'm not going to tell the whole story, but because you all know how it ends up. But this is not unlike the story of humanity. We get distracted. We don't want to deal with our responsibilities in life, and we want to go have fun. This often happens on social media. We see celebrities on yachts and all of these fancy things, or we just see, rich people or just people in general living this lavish lifestyle on social media through Honest John was his name. Thank you. Yeah, that was Honest John. Yeah, which is funny because he's not very honest at all. He's very misleading. So I think forgive me, I'm completely like blanking on things today, this moment. I told you guys I'm nervous, right? Because the level of responsibility today. I forget who wrote the story of Pinocchio, but the names of some of the characters are very interesting. Geppetto, yeah, that's just more of an Italian character. But anyway, I digress. So, talking about Pinocchio, here he is. He had these responsibilities. He wanted, if you all remember the story, Geppetto, his father, made him out of wood. The fairy came and made him a real boy. Remember, that was a big thing. He's like, I want to be a real boy. To me, that symbolizes reincarnation. You wanted to be human. He wanted to experience being a boy and living life and going to school. Like, he was just so eager to do those things. And as he's eager and has all the good intentions in his mind, as he's walking to school, he's going about his business, then he gets misled. It's symbolic of our lives. We have all the intentions of the world to do good, but then we get sidetracked with things, or we sort of ignore some of our responsibilities a little bit, or sometimes we just dream of ignoring it. How many times have we said, man, I just wish I could drop everything and go to Maui? Maybe not Maui anymore, maybe the Maldives. I think Maui is way overcrowded now, but how many times have we at least thought about that? Which is not a bad thing, by the way, if we're just thinking about it. And that's a whole other discussion we've discussed about Joanna and the idea of what she calls psychological escape. It's sometimes in our mind, in order to emotionally manage the situations we're in our mind kind of escapes a little bit. Again, coming back to this moment, I want us to think about this idea of Pinocchio today as we talk about responsibility and our day-to-day lives. Let me just go. So, one thing I also wanted to do, is just to clarify this term, and sometimes it's used interchangeably, but responsibility and accountability are a little bit different. Responsibility is having an obligation, whereas accountability is the acceptance of our role we play in accomplishing and taking care of any particular responsibility. So we all have some form of responsibilities in our lives, and we all should keep ourselves accountable to those things. I think that all makes sense so far, right? We're good on that. Well, let's see what Joanna DeAngelis, and let me step back a second real quick for those who might not be familiar with Spiritism. So this book, for most of us know, was written by the medium, the Brazilian medium, Givaldo Franco, and he psychographed this book. And I think in English terms, that's more common here in the US is channeled. But he psychographed this book and it was written by his spirit guide, Joanna DeAngelis. And she has written a plethora of other books through this medium. So just for level setting, if those who aren't familiar, and she has, like I said, a ton of books, some of which are here, a lot of which are on Amazon. Originally it was in Portuguese, it was translated to English. Fabulous job. I've read through the entire book. It's excellent. So just putting that out there as well. So here is what Joanna starts out this chapter. And just as a reminder, we don't bring every single last word from this chapter because then we'd be here a long time. But these are just meant to be highlights. So go back and read the chapter if you don't have the book, or read the chapter if you do. Either way, get the book and read the chapter. We wanted to just share that. So she says, responsibility is evidence for the acquisition of conscientiousness. Responsibility is evidence for the acquisition of conscientiousness. So let's think about something real quick. How many of you have ever watched the cartoon series The Simpsons? Let me restate this. Let me restate the question. How many of you are familiar with the cartoon The Simpsons? Okay. All right. Yeah. I wasn't allowed to watch Simpsons growing up. Although my brother and I could still snuck it in here and there. There's a character. Do you all know his name is Homer? He's the father. Can you guys? Okay. All right. So Homer is a bit of a dud. He's kind of like an airhead of a man. But his saving grace is that he always aims to be responsible. He tries to be a good husband. He tries to be a good father. He fails very often. But what is very redeeming about him is that no matter what, he wants to be a family man. His main concern is his family. So we can see even in his silliness, in his chaos, in his failing, his goal is to be responsible. So that in of itself is redeeming. And I think this is somewhat of what Joanna's trying to say here. This evidence for the acquisition of conscientiousness. The fact that when we are responsible, when we look at our lives and we say, well, here are my responsibilities and I'm going to do everything to hold myself accountable to those things. I may not be perfect. I may fall short, but I'm going to try my darndest to be responsible for those things and hold myself accountable. That already is a sign that we are more enlightened. We are more conscientious than the average. She says responsibility is based on the discernment of the objectives of earthly existence, driving the individual to ennobling actions along the lines of dignity. So recognizing our responsibilities. Responsibility, she continues, promotes the selection of duties, choosing those that are essential rather than those that may seem beneficial. So, like Pinocchio, in the beginning, when he gets misled, in the beginning, he's being a responsible boy. He's going to go to school. But then, when the fox, honest John, comes in his ear and is like, hey, you don't need these books. You don't need to study. Come to Pleasure Island where it's fun. You can relax. And then Pinocchio goes, you know what? I do need some relaxation. He makes that choice. Sometimes people can make that choice in life. She goes on to say, the tendency to the good is innate in humans due to their divine origin. Carnal numbness sometimes block the ability to choose what conscientiousness suggests. So we are innately good. God's laws are written within us, and we know what is right and what is wrong. But sometimes what she refers to as carnal numbness, sometimes life just really is super distracting, and we can get wrapped up in things that are really not beneficial to us on a spiritual level. But that is also the human experience, right? That is our living and our learning. And recently our daughter went through something, and she was, talking to me and saying, oh, I regret this, I regret that. And I said, don't regret nothing. It was an experience. You lived it, you learn it, you move on. It's the best advice my father ever gave me after I made a huge mistake, or not mistake, I guess I call it a mistake. At the time I thought it was a mistake. A big, a thing that happened when I was very young. And I came to him, and I was like, oh, Dad, what am I going to do? He's like, my father was a man of few words, God rest his soul. He never said much. But when he did speak, it was powerful. And he said, you're going to be fine. You'll be fine. Get up. We're going to go to school. Get your degree. You'll be fine. You move on. And that seems like simple words, but sometimes, and talking about responsibility, we can't help but think about parents and the role of our parents in our lives, and the role of a father is so important when speaking life into your children. And to just and I really think at the time he didn't realize it. And I remember when he was dying, quite literally on his deathbed, I reminded him of that event. And I said, Dad, I am forever grateful to you because you gave me a gift that day. Because I didn't believe in myself in those moments. I felt very destroyed. And I said, your simple words, which I think you didn't even, think twice. It was just normal for you, like, no, you're going to be fine. You're going to, move on. To me, that meant the world. So I digress. He was just being a responsible father and being supportive of his daughter. See how much being responsible really is important in our lives. But she goes on to say, as a result, lucid individuals act wisely, relying on the forthcoming results without worrying about immediacy, knowing that the seed of light always produces clarity. And later on in this chapter, she's going to talk about people that, despite not having immediate results, continue to fighting the good fight. She mentions, and I'll mention it now, she mentions Louis Pasteur. If you're in the medical field, or if you're not, you probably learn this either in high school or I think in high school they probably teach this. I can't even recall anymore. It's been a long time. But Louis Pasteur, being famous for a slew of things, especially recognizing antimicrobials and the significance of those in our lives. And at the time, a lot of people were telling him he was crazy, that he was out of his mind. What is he talking about? But he's continued his research, his work as a scientist, and in the end, now we look back at him and we revere him. And of course, his home country, France, reveres him. But the world over, we are grateful. But oftentimes when we are doing the right thing, humanity or people around us might not always congratulate us. But we have to continue on doing that. A friend of ours who does cancer research a while ago was saying how frustrated he was because he'd have his experiments year after year, and anyone, if you're familiar with working in the field of research, it is very, very challenging and cumbersome. I mean, not even getting into the culture of researchers, that's a whole other thing, but just having to apply for grants and all these things, and not having your experiments work. And he was just expressing how down he felt about, I did 10 years of research down the drain, and he genuinely felt like he had let down humanity because he was not being successful in his cancer research. And he goes to, and mind you, before he tells me this, he had been experiencing this in his head. He was telling me the story. He said, I've been, having all these thoughts in my mind. I didn't even share it with my wife because I was a man. I'm like, macho man, Because I didn't want to tell my wife I felt like this. I just had it in my head. And he said, I went to a lecture by Givaldo. And I listened to the lecture. I don't remember what it was about. And at the end of the lecture, he goes up to Givaldo, as that's usually customary. At the end of his lectures, people like to go and, bring one of the books to get him to sign it. And he goes to get him to sign it. And he greets Givaldo, asks him to sign his book. And Givaldo says to him, look, I have a message for you. And he's just like, stepping out of the way, thinking maybe there's someone behind him, like, oh, maybe it's because the line was huge. And sometimes Givaldo does that. He has like spiritual messages from the beyond to give to people randomly. So he was like, oh, it's for somebody else. And Givaldo's like, no, it's for you. And he said, Joanna is telling me for you not to be discouraged, to continue on your path, that everything that you do is beneficial for science. And he said, I started to get emotional because up until that point, I hadn't really shared with anyone my frustrations. It just, it was in my head, So, and he said, from that moment on, I realized, and looking at other people within science that work really hard towards a goal, that not to wait for immediate results, as she's saying here, relying on the forthcoming results without worrying about immediacy, knowing that eventually we'll get there. Sometimes we're planting and we see this with our kids. We're trying to feed our kids good things spiritually, morally. We're trying to raise them right, and we see them do things and I'm like, oh man, when is it just going to click in their head? And sometimes it doesn't right away. Sometimes it takes a really long time. I'm in my 40s, and things that, my parents told me when I was a kid, it's just clicking now. Like I remember a couple times calling my mother and going, Mom, I get it. I get it. It's taken 45 years. Not 45, I'm making myself older than I am. But it's taken a really long time. But I get that thing that you said. So we should persist and continue. Joanna goes on. The responsibility brought forth by conscientiousness promotes individuals to a level of lucidity that leads them to aspire to the heights of evolution, which they start to seek with ardent devotion. Let's sit with that. think about what you are really, let's think about work, because I think most of us work, right? Um, think about your job or your career that you either had, and think about that sensation you had. So for instance, I'll give you an example. I grew up, my father usually working 3 jobs. And no matter what the weather was like, no matter how he was feeling, I saw my father for 30 years get up every day, 5 a.m. I knew he was getting up because I could smell his Polo cologne down the hallway and I could hear him. So 30 years he did that every morning. And I'd be, as a kid, you're like, oh my gosh, why are you going to work? He'd have the flu, he'd have a cold, he'd be sick. My father went to work. He had several heart attacks before he actually was forced out. Because to him, he had a family to feed. He had 4 children. It didn't matter. I'd see my father I would smell my father at 5 a.m. in the morning. And then I would see him usually for, I'd say the first 15 years, I saw him around 8 or 9 o'clock at night because he had his full-time job, then he was a maitre d', and then he had another job, a third job, which was more here and there. But looking back and thinking about this, when we have that steep sense of responsibility, that, and oftentimes, again, I'm going to use this idea of work ethic. When we have that sense of responsibility, it opens up our mind. And so I was working, and forgive me for giving a lot of personal examples. That's what I can pull from in this moment. But we are working with a group of professionals in the healthcare field, and we were trying to come up with some innovative ideas. And I was really, really blown away and humbled by these group of individuals. And I realized that this is what Joanna's talking about. I was working with a group of individuals that care so deeply about humanity and wanting to help people, that they were coming together. And there's a mix of all of us. We're from different backgrounds and different cultures, but all of them have this ardent desire to help humanity, to see people get better, to be healed, whether it's creating new pathways in the healthcare system or a payment system or whatever it is. But it's this deep sense, and it's only I've noticed, as Joanna's saying here, when we have that sense of responsibility, it brings that consciousness, it brings that awareness that there are greater things at play in our lives and at stake here. And yes, responsibility is what gives meaning to our lives. The people in their lives who have no responsibility, so the Pinocchio, when he went to Pleasure Island, became miserable. And again, this is a representation really of humanity. We can see people out in life that are either come from families where they don't need to work, the children don't need to work, and they live these lavish lifestyles and they have no sense of meaning. We've seen a lot of cases like this. There was the famous swimmer, Michael Phelps. He was interviewed, and it was a great interview. It's on YouTube, about when his life took huge shift. Like, yes, he was very dedicated to swimming, but he felt like his life was devoid of meaning. And then he had this reevaluation, he had this awakening, and he rededicated his life and found spirituality, found God in his own way. And he felt a deeper sense of responsibility before life. So you have to understand, you think about what is or who was or who is Michael Phelps. This is a man who has a lot of money, fame, fortune, and a lot of women at his feet. I mean, he tells it in the story, like, I had everything that you would think would make you happy, like millions of dollars from endorsements, from just, he said, I was partying, I was living life. I was on yachts. I was, having a fantastic time, going to places in the world, just amazing that, most of us would just kind of dream of. But he said, I was not happy. My life didn't have meaning. Responsibility gives life meaning. So this is the advice that Joanna leaves us with. She says, conscientiousness regarding responsibility will lead you never to curse the marsh, but drain it instead. And if you don't know what a marsh is that swampy land, that's like mix of like water and mud. Never to curse the marsh, but to drain it instead. Not to cultivate problems, but solve them instead. Not to erect barriers that hinder your progress, but rather a bridge that will facilitate it. It's very easy for us to have the marsh in our lives, and we get so enthroned or so lacking the word, just so disturbed by what's going on, by problems in our lives. It's hard for us to see through all of it and to find meaning. But the one thing we love about Joanna, as much as she has that feminine energy of being soft and kind, she's also very much a mother and a teacher, in that she's straight to the point. You don't need to curse the marsh. Just drain it. If you have a problem, find ways to solve it. You could sit here and complain, or we can find ways to solve it. I see this in my children, in my 6 and 4-year-old, when they're arguing or they're fighting over something they can't fix. And I'm like, guys, let's just fix the problem. What's the problem? Okay, problem identified. Let's fix it. We can whine, we can complain, and we all do this, or we all have at some point. Or we can just fix the problem. And I love this marital advice. I think it was Salma Hayek. Who knows? Some famous person who was really, famous. I think it was Salma Hayek, said that her and her husband don't argue. I would ask DeMelo, and I know I've sent her this video. She said when they have a problem, they don't focus on who caused the problem, but they focus on how do we fix it, which is not very commonplace for those of us who've ever been married. It's not commonplace. But I thought, wow, that's revolutionary. So of course I sent it out to all my married friends. But focusing on how to solve it, not focusing on the problem itself, because the problem already exists. It's there. The milk is spilled. It's there. Can't do anything to change it. We can change how we approach it. She goes on to say, not to give up the struggle, but persevere to the end, because hope is the light that shines up ahead, pointing out the pathway to victory. She also recommends not to speak ill of others, since you have your own shortcomings. Instead, offer them words of encouragement. Apologies for the typo here. Not to speak ill of others. Does this do not speak ill of others remind you of anything? Yeah, sure. That was a pretty educated guess, yeah. Does it remind you of any text that has existed for many centuries? Paula? Okay, that's really good. Yeah, but it wasn't what I was thinking of, but that's a really good one. The parable of the plank in your eye wasn't what I was thinking of, but that was really good, actually. I could see the connection to that. I'm thinking more about the 10 Commandments. Do not bear false witness against thy neighbor, which essentially is saying, don't gossip. Because we all have our own shortcomings. Instead, offer words of encouragement instead. But none of us here ever gossip, so we don't have to worry about that. Not to become upset because of misunderstandings, but feel alive and therefore vulnerable to the phenomenon of the human journey. This is really interesting. See, when I say, and when others have said that Joanna really pushes the barrier of our understanding, to feel alive amidst misunderstandings. So imagine in your mind, pull up a time when you were initially upset because of something, of misunderstanding that happened. And instead of becoming upset, to feel alive and therefore vulnerable, because that's exactly the emotion we feel. Because why? This is not a question meant to trick anybody, but we're curious what you all think. Why do you think, when Joanna says not to become upset because of misunderstandings, but feel alive and therefore vulnerable, why would we feel vulnerable when we are just triggered? We've become upset. There's been a misunderstanding. There's been an argument, whatever it is, at work, partner, spouse, what have you, a sibling. Instead of becoming upset, feel alive. Why would we be vulnerable in that moment? Any guesses? Mm. You wanna repeat it? Sorry, in the microphone.
I was just thinking that does it have something to do with your own evolution? And this is a lesson to be learned. This is a takeaway. This is a trial that you're exposed to, that you have to, and it's part of your human journey to become a better person.
Yeah. And all that to say, because we are encountering ourselves. So we feel particularly vulnerable. Because when we encounter ourselves, when we are able to recognize and have that conscientiousness of mind to say, you know what, because you first have to recognize something within yourself to be able to change it. So if I'm recognizing that this situation is triggering for me, but instead of being triggered, allow myself to just exist in this moment, feel alive, and therefore vulnerable of the phenomena of the human journey, that this is just an experience. I'm experiencing a difficult moment. I don't have to be in my anger, in my upsetness. This is a very profound idea that Joanna is suggesting here. Dare I say, it's not for the faint of heart, because it takes work on ourselves to be able to, in the moment, sort of separate ourselves from that anger, from that upsetness, and just sit with it and think to yourself, you know, I'm alive. In this moment, I'm experiencing these emotions. She doesn't say that we can't feel those feelings, but instead look at it a different way. Don't waste time in anger, in this sensation of self-pity, because it has never been beneficial in the history of humankind to feel bad for ourselves. but rather to get up, to begin again, to continue on. Can you imagine if the caveman went out that day and didn't, make his kill of the day and was like, you know what? I'm done. He truly was done. He ceased to exist. We have to keep pushing on and embrace the experience. And guess what? It is terrifying when we begin to face ourselves for the first time, and sometimes for the second and the third time. But the more and more you do it and you are coming to grips with yourself, who I am, and this is much easier to find out when you are amongst people, because people trigger us and they trigger things within us. Like sometimes you didn't even know something might be so upsetting until it happens. And one of my sisters said to me, I sent her this movie, and she's like, oh, I've watched that movie before. I said, but watch it again. It's really good. You watched it 10 years ago. Watch it again. She's like, oh, okay. So she watched it again, bawling her eyes out. She calls me, why did you tell me to watch this movie? I said, because I knew after the 10 years have passed that, you're a different person you were 10 years ago. And I knew it was a good kind of cry though. It was like a really touching. So embracing this human journey, this is the phenomenon. This is part of the phenomenon of the human journey. We're going to experience a wide variety and array of experiences. And instead of letting those things drag us down and becoming stuck, to flow with it, to move with it, and to keep growing with it. And I read one of the, I want to say it was Viktor Frankl. Was Viktor Frankl or another gentleman that came out of the Holocaust and wrote a book. And said that he found that those that survived the Holocaust and still mentally and emotionally did well after and during, more so during, were the ones that didn't react to what was happening to them during the Holocaust, but instead just experienced it as it went and looked at it with a curiosity. And somehow, some of that mentally and emotionally helped them get through it. And when thinking about as we experience trauma and really difficult experiences in our lives, instead of approaching it in a reactionary way, but approach it with curiosity and compassion for ourselves. Curiosity and compassion. Important. She finalizes this particular section. She says, responsibility is not conducive to self-pity, presumptuousness, moral weakness, violence, lust for vile desires, or numbing pleasures. So when we are responsible, we won't be inclined towards self-pity because we have that higher goal, that higher purpose. And remembered earlier, I shared that Joanna gives examples of people, real life people, that had that deep sense of responsibility and continue to move on despite their obstacles. Louis Pasteur, opposed by scholars of his time, responsibly continued his discoveries of microbes, rabies prophylaxis, anthrax, and all types of contagious diseases, and even the milk that we drink. Kepler, a famous German astronomer and mathematician, he was persecuted, but aware of the charts of the heavens, he persisted until he could present a remarkable theory about the planet Mars and formulate other laws that honor his name. Interestingly enough, Joanna talks about how he was persecuted, and he was so hated for making assumptions about, and to me, well, this is, I guess, astronomy is not simple by any means. Or astrology or astronomy are not simple. He had proposed at the time, which was not at the time believed, that Mars had its own, that the orbit that Mars made was not circular, but rather oval shaped. And that was like, at that time in the 1600s, that was as bad as saying the devil is my best friend or something. He was so hated that they attacked his mother and tried to, and him as well, saying that he was involved in witchcraft. This was, and for those of you who are familiar with history, I love history, it was a very popular tactic if you wanted to get someone killed, banished, or maimed, was to accuse them of witchcraft. They could likely get burned or killed in some other horrific way. So that's the extent to which he was so hated. But despite that, he still continued on working in mathematics. He'd come up with other things in mathematics that I couldn't even begin to explain to you. But he was a great mind. And Dr. Hansen responsibly delved into his research until he managed to isolate the leprosy bacillus, saving millions of lives. So now, oftentimes, the disease leprosy is not referred to as leprosy anymore. It's referred to as Hansen's disease because of this particular researcher. And people told him he was crazy. And you have to manage, we read this on a screen, we read this in a book, but you have to try to put yourself in that, in the minds of these gentlemen. Because being and working in science and having your colleagues, your esteemed colleagues, tell you that you're crazy, that you should give up your life's work, that you're just insane, is pretty powerful. And think of all the names of the men and women who we don't know who did give up. But these are the ones that we still know today because they didn't give up on their responsibility, because they felt this huge responsibility to mankind to find and research for these illnesses and diseases, etc. She goes on to say, Copernicus anathematized or responsibly demonstrated the twofold movement of the planets and the heliocentric system, paying a high price for his audacious awareness. These people were killed in horrendous ways for coming up and with these theories. At the time, they were theories of our solar system, of our planets. Those of you who are familiar with Galileo and know his story. Sorry. Those of you who know are familiar, or does anyone, I cannot speak English. Is anyone familiar with Madame Curie? Okay. So her and her husband were famous, right? So the Curies were responsibly engaged in tiresome experiments that opened new horizons for knowledge about radioactive materials. Really interesting. Madame Curie used to carry around something that was radioactive. At the time, they didn't realize how bad radioactivity was for you. Obviously, she died due to all those issues. But they were the Curies, both her husband, both Madame Curie and whatever her husband's name is, Dr. Curie, also worked diligently in their areas of work, always with the same mindset, that same sense of personal responsibility. Joanna continues, responsibility is a step on the ladder of conscientiousness. It fulfills men and women in all situations. So having that sense of responsibility, like the Homers of the world, we may falter and we may not be great, But the mere fact that we have our responsibilities and we are trying our best to attend to those things, that gives us credence. Is that the word, credence? That gives us joy in our lives. And that also is a symbol of our level of evolution and self-awareness, or rather conscientiousness. So however we may view ourselves, as imperfect as we are, if we at the bare minimum can take care of our responsibilities, it's already a step in the right direction. Basically, that's what Joanna is telling us. And as she ends with, as she always does in these later chapters, she ends with a question from the Spirit's book, question 780. And for those who aren't familiar, the Spirit's book are one of the 5 pillars of literature in Spiritism. And the Spirit's book, question 780, Kardec asks the spirits, does moral progress always follow intellectual progress? What do you guys think? Does moral progress always follow intellectual progress? In other words, if we work hard enough to become really intelligent, will our morality and sense of it just follow? Okay. Folks are saying, no, not really. The spirits answer, the wise and high spirits answered, it is its consequence, but it does not always follow it immediately. And Joanna ends with, it obviously depends on one's conscientiousness of responsibility. So no, merely having intelligence and a high level of it doesn't always, morality doesn't always follow right behind it automatically, in tandem, as some books say. But it can eventually. But again, it depends on us. It depends on our everyday choices. And we wanted to link together, and then we're going to bring the next one. Actually, hold on. I wanted to link together this idea of responsibilities and goal setting. And there is research out there, research on conscientiousness, and there's something called the goal setting theory, or GST. And basically, to layman's terms, the idea that people who set goals for themselves and are responsible and honorable individuals, they are happier and more successful. To this idea, especially of goal setting, because it doesn't matter who we are, where we come from, what stage of life that we're in, we can still set our goals for ourselves. And I remember hearing something from my husband that his mother said to him growing up, that translated into English, I feel like it has more power in Portuguese, but she would say to my husband, she'd say, my son, we may be poor, but we're not miserable. So we're going to keep our house clean. We're going to be organized. We're going to be good people in the community. We're going to go to church. We're going to do all these things. And that always struck me because, no matter where we come from, we could still be good people. We could still have good moral values. And this is most telling. If you remember who Jiminy Cricket was in the story of Pinocchio, Jiminy Cricket was his conscience, as they say. It was that the little, and I should have brought a picture of, he was tall to Pinocchio, and this little itty bitty cricket, who would just kind of like say to him, don't do that. No, Pinocchio, don't do that. So he was always saying to Pinocchio, trying to guide him in the right direction. And there's a song in the movie, and Jiminy Cricket says, always let your conscience be your guide. It's actually a really good for Disney. It's a really good movie. It's a great meaning behind it. What Jiminy Cricket tries to portray to Pinocchio, to be a good boy, to be responsible, to be kind, to be loving. And that whenever he's in a pickle, or whenever he finds himself in a situation where he, doesn't know what to do, he says, listen to what your inner voice is telling you to do. And that's our best guiding star. Because even in the Spirit's book, it tells us that our intuition, our gut instinct will always lead us in the right direction. When we're in the heat of the moment, listen to what your gut is telling you, because that is primordial. We've had that since forever in our existence. So always let that inner voice guide you. So some takeaways, some tips on how to be more of a responsible person. And these are 9 habits to be more responsible. 1, be accountable for yourself, and I would say to yourself. You also can have an accountability partner. You can have someone who, and me and my best friend of 30 years, we used to do this for a number of years, where we would call each other and keep ourselves accountable when we were trying to, work on a particular goal or whatnot. But also being, accountable to yourself. Journaling is really good at this as well. Benjamin Franklin was really good at keeping his own tally of how he was working on himself. Number 2, being punctual. Being punctual, we don't really think, you might not think of that as being and connected with being responsible, but it is. It is quite connected to responsibility, both for yourself and also for those or wherever you're going to. Getting organized. Ooh, yeah. Always a good thing. My mother growing up used to say, if you're ever anxious, go organize a drawer. So there's something to organization. It just clears out a lot of energy. 4, quit procrastinating. Don't leave for tomorrow what you can do today. And I heard this other phrase of a woman who said, and I apply this to my family, don't put it down, put it away. Don't put it down, put it away. So for example, in the morning, I'm making my kids waffles. I get the syrup bottle, put the syrup bottle on the table, and okay, there's that. Then I'm also making them a bagel with cream cheese. Get the cream cheese out, put that on the table as well. And then I'm doing other things, and everything's kind of like out of place. And so by the end of the day, I'm looking at my kitchen, and it's in such disarray. But had I applied the rule, don't put it down, put it away, don't procrastinate, clean as you go, stay organized as you go. So if I had gotten that syrup bottle, I'm done using it for the kids, go put it back. We have created this system in our home that everything has a home. The kids' toys have a home, food has a home, toilet paper has a home, everything has a home. When you go shopping, bring them. Toilet paper does not belong at the bottom of the steps. I always leave it there. Don't procrastinate. Be organized. We don't think of this. I don't think we naturally would think this is about responsibility. But these little things, being able to be organized, being able to be punctual, to not procrastinate, these help us to be more responsible. This is a big one. Number 5, keep your emotions in check. This requires a ton of personal work on ourselves. A ton of personal work. Ladies, I will say, there is a lot of apps out there to track our cycle. It'll let you know which phase of the cycle and where your hormones could be, not wanting to blame that on certain emotions that certain times of the month can happen, but it's very fascinating to follow that and track it through an app through the years, and you can see the data and how more or less how accurate it can be. So it can be a way for us to track, like, okay, I know that hormonally I'm going through this. How can I work through that preemptively? Just a little tidbit there to help keeping our emotions in check. Guys, I'm sorry, I don't know if you guys go through things, but as human beings, I'm sure you do. 6, stop whining. We say this to our kids all the time, oh, stop whining, stop whining. As adults, we tend to whine as well. Stop whining and fix the problem if there is one. 7, trust. Be willing to work to earn someone's trust. Being a responsible person also means being trustworthy. And trust and honesty is a big part of that. I know I'm going over here. So 8, be dependable, meaning be consistent. And 9, exercise self-discipline. And last but not least, on the right-hand side, being responsible means doing the things that you need to get done, even if you don't feel like doing them. Choosing to do the right thing, even when it's hard. Taking ownership for your actions, like trying to make a situation better when you make a mistake. As Jesus said, I think in a biblical text somewhere, go and make peace with your brother while you're on the road with him. And when you make a mistake, say, I'm sorry. I know, guys, it's hard. I can print it on a shirt for you. I'm sorry. Make it easier. Following through, lastly, with what you say you will do, keeping our word. These are all ways in which we can be responsible and to attain responsibility. So, friends, I'm 5 minutes over. Thank you so much for listening. At this time, I will take any comments or questions. If not, we will move to the last part of our session, which is we do passes. Doing passes tonight, yes? Our passes and our spiritualized blessed water, which we'll explain. But I will step back for a moment and see, do we have any questions, any comments? I can change the screen. Okay.
Simply, thank you.
Oh, no one made a comment. I'm so sad. Does anyone here, and don't feel obligated to, you don't have to. Sometimes Joanna is just about taking in, oh, good old faithful Paula. Yes, ma'am.
I
Please.
feel a responsibility, especially since Yasko is not here.
Yes.
I always let her do it. But,
Yeah.
no, it's a very helpful talk. Thank you. And in general, I believe it's a very good talk for people who are already basically responsible to deepen their capacity and to get free of some of their, frustrations. So I'm curious, I'm going to put like 2 sentences together out of this chapter about those who maybe aren't there yet. Joanna says that carnal numbness sometimes blocks the ability to choose what conscientiousness suggests. This is all on 155. And then the last sentence is the state of unawareness in which many individuals linger is responsible for their prevailing aggressiveness and ignorance. So my curiosity is what sparks those people out of those states to start to process this material or start to grow like this.
Read that last passage again, because it's part of the book I did, as part of the chapter I didn't include.
I
Okay.
know it's not fair because I know you couldn't
No,
do
that's
it.
okay.
You
No,
could-
I've read it, so.
You couldn't do every sentence. It in one paragraph, it's just talking about what she calls carnal numbness, and
Mhm.
that's blocking the ability to be conscientious. And then the statement is the state of unawareness in which many individuals linger is responsible for their prevailing aggressiveness and ignorance.
And so your question is, how do they get out of that?
Yeah,
or
like what
per-
sparks them out of that?
Mm. I love the question, Paula. I love it. In Joanna's book, not this one, in that one, Existential Conflicts, Joanna actually talks about this spark and that how for some people, something in their lives will happen and it just kind of like the light bulb goes on and then they change, right? Like Paul of Tarsus, Saul became Paul. That was more dramatic, of course. But I would say for the average everyday folks, pain is what oftentimes will get us out of that. And sometimes pain alone doesn't get us out. It's the level of pain, because there are plenty of people in the world and plenty of us have gone through experiences where we experienced some pain, but it wasn't that bad because we went back to it. And then it got really bad. And you're like, oh no, I think I need to, stop with this. So when we reach a certain level of pain and discomfort and struggle, it forces us into facing the situation. We become extremely uncomfortable, so much where it causes a shift in us. And we can go one of two ways. We can go the Judas route. And for those who know the story of Judas, he chose to take his life after he did what he did, when he thought he knew more than Jesus. But then he was like, oh, wait a second, that was probably a bad idea. And the spiritualist literature tells us that the level of regret and remorse that he felt was so intense that he chose to end it. In his mind, thinking, well, I'm going to end it, and so it'll end this, when really it didn't end it. Or we go the other route that Peter took. Peter denied Christ 3 times, right? He had, remorse and regret for what he did. He felt horrible. But Peter went on to, as we know historically, he went out into the different countries and places to put down Christ's teachings. So we have the choice, right? We go through suffering, and I'd say 50% of the time the gospel tells us we are the cause of our own suffering through our erroneous habits or bad habits, or, just not being mindful, or whatever the reasons are. We tend to create our own problems. Not always, but sometimes. So pain is what really will get people out. And we see these examples in human beings all the time. I've seen it for 10 years working with addicts. No matter how much their family tried to get involved and to help them, nothing would ever change them, except when they were ready and they were tired of it, which usually meant they had gone through a significant amount of pain and suffering and they were just done. And I think that's analogous to the rest of us, right? When we're just done going through something, we want to change, we want to shift. And yeah, so thank you for asking the question, Paula. It was a great question. And if I can find the chapter where she talks about the spark that can happen for some people, I'll share it with you. Yeah.
But it might not happen in this lifetime.
But it might not happen in this lifetime. That is 1,000% true, Yvonne. It might not. And that is, I think, the hardship of every parent, sometimes looking at our children and them not getting it right, or us looking at them thinking they're not getting it right. And sometimes it's the acceptance of they might not get it this life. It might be the next life. for us who believe in multiple, lifetimes, at least we have some solace. But for those who don't, they may not take solace in that. But I will say, having worked in the healthcare field for 15 years, and although I did not specifically work in hospice, I did work with hospice patients. And I will say a vast majority of patients, as they're dying at the end, do come to a lot of realizations about their lives, about what they did or what they shouldn't have done, how they had regretted things and how they wish they would have done things differently, how they, had now had the clarity of mind of seeing things so differently. And I, again, I saw this professionally, and I saw this in my own father as well, go through that experience. Anybody else? If not, we can move on.
Yes. Final question, I guess. I was just thinking about those 9 steps. It's a lot, right? My question is, what is the line if you do all the 9 steps to become that you become like a 100%, I would say, in the level that we are a responsible person, a true responsible person, because I guess we are all responsible at some level, and the OCD level, right? Because, if you become too much organized, and a point that you cross, I mean, your life doesn't move on because you forgot to put stuff away, something like that. So OCD versus responsibility. So is there a line? If you would like to comment on that.
Yeah. So I'm going to respond to that 2 things. 3 things. 1, we live in a culture where we become very sensitive to people's comments and questions. And for a long time, I didn't like, and I'm sharing this because I learned something and I hope to impart this knowledge with you. I didn't like when folks often they use the term OCD so flippantly, or so like, oh, it's my OCD. When this is an actual psychiatric ailment. It's obsessive compulsive disorder. And those of you who have experienced it or know someone, it's horrible. It's a horrible illness. Nobody wants it when they have it. So that's at a pathological level, and that's not at all what we're talking about here. And I think if you have that level of pathology, obviously you should be getting involved with a specialist, a therapist, a psychiatrist, psychologist, and seeking the help you need to sort of go through and unblock whatever it is, in your psyche, in your mind, whether it's something from a past life, which oftentimes is, we bring in, baggage from many lifetimes. So that becomes much more complex, right? We're not trying to say, be at the level where it's pathological, where you can't exist unless everything is perfectly where it should be. Like, some people get upset if there's a spoon in the sink and it's out of place. We're not talking about that level of pathology. I know I'm not referring to the one I'm married to who's like that. Right. No. Get organized. We're not talking about perfection here. And sometimes we can get hung up on being perfect and wanting perfection. And I heard someone say this, and I'm still processing and sitting with this, but I heard someone say that perfectionism is somehow tied to egoism because we want to appear like we are perfect. And perhaps some of that is true. We want to do our best. And I think in our heart of hearts, we want to be good. We want to do the right thing. But what I love about Joanna is that she tells us to give ourselves grace. Give yourself compassion. Be gentle with yourself. I found myself saying this to my 6-year-old. Be gentle with yourself. And you have to teach them when they're young, because when you're already adults, having to learn that is it's hard to learn self-compassion when you weren't taught that or you aren't used to that. It's very nuanced. So as you are working towards being a better person, being more responsible, getting more organized, and doing all these things, also be gentle with yourself. Nowhere in any of the literature by Joanna or otherwise says that we should be severe and harsh and, penalize ourselves. Does that answer your question, Daniel? Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you all. Go and get the book off Amazon. It's a fantastic book. So now for our second part of our session, we're going to be doing what we call the passes. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what the passes are, here in the United States, I think it was popularized. Well, there's a form of it, or something similar to it, I should say. The most similar thing I could think of is the laying on of hands. So it is just we come up to receive passes. You'll sit in the chair, and another one of the directors, one of the workers here, myself, Leo, Johnny, or Daniel, sometimes Jeanette, we don't touch you. Our hands go right above your chakras, or what we call vital centers. And what we believe happens is that there are special spirit workers that are here in the spirit plane, helping and working through us to bring those chakras, or again, we call them vital centers, into balance. We do believe that there are those points of energy in our body, whether it's a spirit body or whatnot, that need rebalancing. Because throughout the day, we're stressed, we have a lot of worries and things that are going on, and they can be, unbalanced. So, having said that, we're going to dim the lights. The music is going to be playing. We're going to cut the live stream. Thank you, Daniel. And also, as we await to come at the front, to sit in the chairs to receive